Welcome back to IGN's History of Awesome, a year-by-year breakdown of important movies, TV shows, and video games that shape pop culture. In 1989, the Sega Genesis did what Nintendo didn't, but Nintendo had a big system launch of its own. On TV, The Simpsons began its incredible run that is still going strong today. And in theaters, it was the summer of Batmania. Let's take a look at everything awesome that happened in 1989.
IGN's History of Awesome series continues with 1989. I'm Damon Hadfield. I'll be your host to this time out. I'm joined by Steve Butts, Tal Blevins, Andrew Goldfarb. Gentlemen, 1989 was another awesome year for all the pop culture stuff that we cover here at IGN.
It was a great wrap up to the 80s, right? I mean, we
For sure.
have a bunch of cool stuff. We have Batman, we have Simpsons, we have a lot to talk about. We have Mega Man 2.
Great year to be a toddler. Really good year to be a toddler.
How old were you in 89?
I was 3.
What did you think of the Batman movie? Did you see it in
Oh,
theaters?
loved it. It wasn't mature enough for me at that time, but yeah, really liked it.
Starting on the video game side of things, Mega Man 2, as you mentioned, was released on July 11th, 1989. Considered probably one of the best games of the 8-bit generation.
And of the franchise, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a
Fans
good
kind of go
argument
back
to
and
make.
forth with whether or not 2 or 3 is really the best Mega Man game.
Right. I mean, kind of surprising it even really came out at all, right?
Sure, because the first one wasn't that big a hit. But word of mouth kind of spread. I remember hearing about it literally on the playground at school. My friends were telling me about this new game that I had to check out.
It's like while they were beating you up. They were
Yeah.
like, check out that.
It's like, you don't know
It's
what
the
Mega
early
Man is?
days of IGN, just people beating you up on the playground.
But the Capcom let the creators go ahead and make a sequel, and then Nintendo Power really pushed the sequel. It got a cover feature, it had a huge spread in the magazine, and I remember checking it out and being amazed at how big the sprites were. I was like, oh my god, this is Robot Dog, it's like a fourth of my TV screen. And then it was a big hit. It was a huge success.
That was back in the day, too, when games were freaking hard. I
Yeah,
mean, you know.
sure.
Yeah.
We kind of had a
This
resurgence of that recently, but
Yeah.
Mega Man 2 was
They actually
super
introduced
tough.
a password system for the sequel, so it made it a little bit easier. So it would say after you beat a boss, it would give you a password that you could.
And in the instruction manuals, there was always a field for notes that I actually used for all those
Right.
passwords. Yeah, Mega Man 2 was a weird one because I didn't have an NES, and so I would go to my friend's house, and I was like pretty young. I was in like 1st or 2nd grade, and I would go to my friend's house to play NES, and he had Mega Man 2, and like his like older brother played and could like beat it, but like I literally couldn't do it. I was like awful. Like I was like embarrassingly bad.
One of the cool things about it was if you got stuck on one particular boss, you could go try another one.
Yeah.
I mean, there were opportunities for you to go try something else in the game. You didn't sort of hit this roadblock and you couldn't go anywhere else.
Yeah.
Until you got to Dr. Wily, and then it was just
then,
like, yeah.
Yeah. Then you go through the gauntlet.
There have been 10 mainline Mega Man games over the years. Would it surprise you to know that Mega Man 2 is the best-selling of all of them?
Even
all the way
today,
back from
wow.
1989.
Actually, wouldn't
crazy.
surprise me. I mean, again, like you're saying, it had such a great buzz at that time. I think it was, 89 was just a monumental year for the NES anyway, and that was really one of the standout games. It's really getting its stride. You know, it had been in the market for, 4 years by that point, so there were a lot of units out there. And it was a great game.
Well, I wonder how much it sold in the first year, because it was going up against all the stuff going on with the Genesis and the Game Boy.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there were other things for gamers to spend their money on. So I wonder if some of those sales weren't, 1990 and maybe in the
That's
early
okay.
90s. Yeah.
Came out a little bit before the Genesis, but yeah.
A little bit before the
think,
Game
right?
Boy,
Yeah.
which was launched the same month on July 31st. Nintendo's big, second handheld system after the Game & Watch series.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was a really awesome piece of hardware at the time. You look at it today, and it's kind of like quaint and it's weird.
Was it an awesome piece of hardware, though? Because for me, it was always funny. I worked at Babbage's at the time, and it was funny to me because we had the Lynx in around the same time. I think Lynx came out a few months after the Game Boy. But you're talking about this full-color screen that just looked amazing, like you had games that were almost as good as what you're getting on consoles in your hand, and the Game Boy was still this black and white, blocky system. The price point. I think the price point really sold it, right? I think it was about $90 when it first came out.
And just the form factor too, like the fact that it was that
That's
small.
it, yeah.
Because for me, it was like that was the first, I guess, video game thing I owned. Like long before we had anything in my house, and my grandma bought a Game Boy just to play Tetris, and then I'd like after a couple of years, it like sat in a drawer. So like then I
She
sort of
bought it for
inherited
herself to play Tetris?
Yeah.
That's
Well,
awesome.
that's
And
the thing, right? I think a lot of the things that sold Game Boy too was Tetris.
Yeah,
Tetris was what Game Boy
I
was
can't
all
even.
about.
There's no way for me to even quantify how much Tetris I must have played as a kid because that was just like like back of the car or like doing anything. It was just like I was on a Game Boy playing
Tetris was back in the day what Angry Birds is now, where it's like
Yeah.
it's a game that's like everywhere. If you owned anything, eventually Tetris showed up on it at some point.
My microwave,
but the
I think,
Game
could
Boy
play it.
was, I think, a lot of people's first exposure to it. And what was great about The handheld was you didn't need to get somebody in front of a TV to try it out. You could literally go to your mom or your grandma and just say, "Here, try this." And that was the only barrier to entry, is you actually handing it to them.
And batteries, I used to carry a huge thing just filled with batteries with me on like every trip we went on, because I just like knew I would play until it
That's
died.
good for self-defense too, if you have just like a pillowcase full of batteries.
I was a really tough 6-year-old.
So was the Game Boy. It was solid. I mean, it was a brick, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say it's an amazing piece of hardware. You could drop that thing down the stairs and you're fine.
I used to play like on the beach. Like if my family went on family vacations, I didn't do anything but sit there and play Game Boy. And it's like funny because it like went through like water damage, and I would drop it all the time, and it just like, throw it into my backpack and like stuck under my bed, and like it was always fine.
There's that famous Game Boy that was like burned in the Iraq War for the soldier had, and it still worked.
Yeah, it's in the Nintendo World Store in New York. They still have it on display. They have it like plugged in and stuff. It's cool.
Yeah. Now, I had been a gamer for, over a decade by the time the Game Boy came out, and I don't think anybody in my family really cared about games until they saw the Game Boy. And again, Tetris was the thing that kind of got them interested in that, because it was a concept they could understand. It was a little bit simpler.
It's abstract, it's puzzly, it's not like elves or aliens. Like there's no sort of self-consciousness about that.
I think that's when they, my family actually were kind of interested in what my hobby was.
Yeah.
It was so tied to the platform too. Like for me, like, and again, I was like a little kid, so I was dumb. But it's like I didn't realize that was anything other than a Tetris machine for like years. And then like when I got WarioLand or something like way later, and it blew my mind that you could like put other games in it.
You're like, Dad, there's a new Game Boy. It plays Wario.
Exactly.
I mean, you're talking about like one of the best-selling systems of all time.
119 million units sold, including the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Color.
Yeah.
Wow.
Same family.
It was one of those systems at my house where like people were fighting over could I play it. My mom, my sister, and me. It was like, whenever that thing sat idle, somebody grabbed it.
The combination of it being portable and having Tetris got a lot of adults playing video games that hadn't been playing games, the whole decade prior.
Well, like Tal was saying, the barrier to entry was just really low. Like it was just an easily 90 bucks is like not like pocket change or anything, but it's like.
I think the other systems, I think Game Gear came out the next year, and I think even that was maybe the lowest cost, but I think even that was like 150. So you're talking almost twice the price of what you're getting for the.
Did Game Gear really come out in 1990?
I think so. We'll talk about that in the 1990s.
Wait till next year's discussion. Yeah, spoilers.
But the Lynx was out in '89, because I remember having them both in the store, and I was maybe 16 then when I was.
You talk about some of the other contenders, like Game Boy's still a brand. Like that's the one that's still around,
Yeah.
Well, Micro was the last one, right?
Yeah.
Sort of counts.
They officially discontinued the Game Boy line in like 2005, I think.
Well,
But
first it was
about a run, Yeah.
Exactly.
But I mean, the point being, very obviously that led to the DS. Very obviously that is like a line they've continued. And even it's funny because looking at like the 2DS now, it's like that obviously traces its roots back to the Game Boy. It's actually really interesting that like Nintendo. I don't know, I think this obviously began that, in the middle of that console era, in the middle of the NES being so popular, this started a whole other very important part of their business.
Yeah. I think it's an example of Nintendo really being a leader, because they dominated in the 80s home console area so significantly. Like, they didn't need to create a handheld device, but they did. And it was a huge success.
You could also consider there were so many people who had them too. You could multiplayer game. You had to use a cable.
Yeah.
You didn't have Wi-Fi back then.
No. But I totally used the link cable to play Tetris against friends. For sure. Created by Gunpei Yokoi, Nintendo Research and Development 1, the same staff who had designed the Game & Watch, and it stuck. I think it was significant that it stuck with the exact same controls as the NES, just the D-pad and the A/B buttons.
Which makes it super easy for developers when they've got a game that works on one platform. They don't have to really think a lot about how that would translate over to a different control scheme.
It's also interesting that it came with headphones, because I don't think the DS or the Vita comes with
I
headphones.
don't think anything comes with headphones, yeah.
Not just your iPhones.
For a long time, you couldn't even get an HDMI cable with a console.
We're talking about the design and the build of that. I mean, it looked a lot like an NES too, right? Like it came out, it looked almost like a little shrunk NES with a screen built right into it.
It wasn't shrunk that much, actually.
So they carried over, that the gray casing, and it kind of had that same cube blocky look to it. It was very good in keeping kind of their brand design going on too.
Yeah, I think by virtue of being mine, I have probably more fond memories with the Game Boy than with the NES. Because I never actually owned my own NES. It's a tough childhood. It's just rough.
You're an inspiration.
We're going to start a fundraising, like a charity relief program for you right after this.
To be fair, you were what, 5 by the time the SNES came out, so
yeah, probably.
You probably moved right into that era pretty
Launch games were Super Mario Land, Alleyway, Baseball, Tetris, and Tennis. So 3 sort of generic sports games. I liked Alleyway a lot myself. That was like a breakout Arkanoid type game.
Of those, though, it's pretty easy to understand why Tetris was such the blockbuster
for sure.
hit early on, right? I mean, that really, I think, was the most captivating of those titles.
And Super Mario Land is kind of a weird Mario game.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird stuff. He like flies a plane in it at one point.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
And the blurry screen made it a little bit difficult to play a platform like that at that time. Yeah.
That was the one thing, as durable as that thing is, the screen like faded after a while, and it was just impossible to even see what you were doing.
It almost looked like an Etch-a-Sketch.
Yeah, and like some games tried to use like gradient effects almost, like there would be like lighter things, it would just be a disaster. Disaster, Steve.
Other notable Game Boy games, the Game Boy gave us Pokemon.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh my god.
Right?
Spent so much time with Pokemon.
The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is some people's favorite Legend of Zelda game.
That's too bad for them, but okay.
They reimagined Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, and it's incredible. It's amazing. It's not just like a remake of the original Donkey Kong. It's a totally different like puzzle game. And then they had the Final Fantasy Legends series. I think there were like 3 of them on Game Boy, and that was, I believe, the first really portable RPG series. It's pretty interesting. All right, moving on. The Sega Genesis came out the same year, August 14th. Although it had been out for about a year in Japan.
Right.
But released over here on August 14th.
As the Mega Drive.
Yeah, that's interesting that like back then, consoles were named different things in different locations, in different regions of the world.
I personally like the Genesis name better, so I'm glad North America got that. I remember that being, to me, it coming out a little bit before the SNES, and that to me is compared to the NES, because we were in high school at the time. It just seemed like the cooler, sleeker. It was black, it looked like really slick. You saw the game's graphics were like really cool as compared to the NES. So that really captured me. I mean, I owned a Genesis, and Steve and I actually lived together in college, and we had the Genesis in the house.
It sat right next to the Nintendo. And like the Nintendo,
we played the Genesis a lot
looked
more.
like a toy.
Yeah.
Like it was less cool to have on your shelf.
Well, even though, the SNES, which was that gray and purple, right next to that black and red, and gray.
It just looked more dangerous.
Well, the controller.
You guys brought girls home and you hide the NES, put the Genesis towards the front of the shelf.
I love the idea that you thought we brought girls home.
The controllers look like batarangs, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they were rounded, and then they introduced a third button.
The extra button. I mean, there was another thing that it had over the Nintendo system,
Now, I'll say that the Genesis, for me, the launch lineup was not fantastic. The pack-in game was Altered Beast, not that great of a pack-in game.
At the time, I didn't know. At the time, I thought it was awesome. I didn't know it was a really terrible game.
But later in the life cycle, I mean, there were so many games out for the Genesis. I think that's one of the things that made it so popular, is that Genesis actually outsold SNES, over, a span of about 4 years at Christmas time, because a big part of that was because of the games library and because of the licensees that they had. And just how the graphics look. I mean, it just looked more advanced.
Well, they were pretty aggressive in their marketing too, with the whole Genesis does what Nintendo don't. I mean, they really went after their competition, and like you said, dominated. Nintendo had owned that market for years, and Sega came along and just started stealing it away from them.
And a couple years into it, Sonic the Hedgehog came out, and that was a huge breakout hit for Sega. Still really popular today with our readers.
Yeah, that would end up being the best-selling game for the system, although of course it was a pack-in game.
Yeah.
This is actually Sega's 3rd console. I didn't realize this. Before the Master System in Japan, they had a system called the SG-1000, and there was a SG-1001 and an SG-1002.
Yeah, I didn't know that either, actually, until we were researching that a little bit, because I had a Master System as well, and the Master System didn't have that great of games. It wasn't that fun for me, but the Genesis was just a great system.
What a weird name for a consumer product, an SG-1000.
Well, not that weird for Japan.
Yeah, well, that's true, I guess. I just can't imagine anything coming out now.
SG stands for Sega Game.
Yeah. Not that weird, I'm sorry.
The Genesis would outsell the Super Nintendo 4 Christmases in a row. It had a lower price point and 10 times the games.
That's it too. That's right. The lower price point as well. Now, kind of what I saw as the downfall of the Genesis is that they tried to keep putting on these crazy weird add-ons that nobody really wanted. Some of them were pretty inventive.
Sega CD,
I mean, they had
32X.
Exactly. They had some pretty inventive and innovative things that would become to be just kind of standard later in console development. But it did seem like you were just putting a lot more money into a system that was kind of old, and you're ready for the next system.
I remember though when we first brought back that multi-tap and were able to play 4-player games with things like General Chaos. I'm not even sure what year that was, if that was in the first year of it, but
no, I think General Chaos was a little bit later. Right. But speaking of multi-tap, games like NHL '94. games like the BattleTech game that we played with. That was just 2-player, but that you could play. One person actually could work the guns, and the other one the legs. And I was usually the legs, so I played the chicken legs.
It was like the most, it was the most ridiculous multiplayer concept where it was like, you guys are a giant robot. One of you walks and the other one shoots. And you're like,
it was a lot of fun though.
This makes sense. Oh no, it was a fantastic.
We totally
experience.
finished that game. But yeah, things like when we would get together and have all of our our friends over, and you could play 4-player games with each other on one screen. That was fantastic.
Yeah. You talk about the sort of edgier vibe that the Genesis had. The increasingly violent games that were showing up on the Genesis at the time, Congress taking note of that is what eventually led to the ESRB. Games like Mortal Kombat on the Genesis, they didn't censor out the blood in the first game, and then on Night Trap on the Sega CD.
Yeah, that was another thing. Nintendo and Mortal Kombat, like you beat them up and like green sweat flew off their body, right? That was another sort of.
NHL had the blood on the ice.
Yeah, it was another characterization of the way the two different systems handled content.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I think it was one thing for me too, is just being able to play, having somebody who we live together and being able to play multiplayer games with each other. Like Pigskin is not a game that a whole lot of people know, but Pigskin Football. We used to play the heck out of that and waiting for the trolls to come out. If you don't know about it, it's this medieval football game. Where basically you can hang people, you can hit people in the face with a mace. If one person's losing really badly, you can get a troll on your team who's faster and stronger. So there were just these kind of like these weird concept games that were out on the Genesis too, and the library was so diverse. Road Rash was fantastic, motorcycle game.
But then like the standard stuff that people play all the time, like Mickey's Castle of Illusion or Gunstar Heroes. I mean, there were so many like games that were. Be perfectly acceptable and accessible to people today if that were just phenomenal in the system.
The animation on Mickey's Castle of Illusion was what totally blew me away.
Aladdin, both those are great.
I just remember like the if you didn't touch the controller for a
while,
and Mickey, the idle animation, and Mickey would just kind of sway back and forth with his hands behind his back and kind of start whistling, and I was just amazed. I was like, oh, that looks so good.
Yeah.
You also played Moonwalker.
Yes.
Michael Jackson's Moonwalker.
Yes, and the only reason, it wasn't a great game, in all fairness, but I did love making dogs dance, and this is before the days of YouTube, where you could watch that at any moment that you wanted to.
They were so far ahead of their time.
Yeah, they were.
Back then. It's funny you mentioned Michael Jackson, because when you mentioned tennis as one of the launch games earlier, back in the day,
Game Boy.
back in the day,
Michael Jackson's tennis?
They had to they wanted to attach people's names to these sports because it used to be you could just call a game baseball and like it's our baseball game, we call it baseball. Like that doesn't work anymore.
Joe Montana football.
That was the standard back in the day. But yeah, Joe Montana football came out and
Buster Douglas.
Yeah, Buster Douglas boxing,
Mike Tyson,
and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker is exactly in that same category, right? Like they want to put that name recognition out there front and center, so people who maybe don't understand what this is all about at least recognize something.
It's almost a weird curve for movies or something, right? Like you have to have a star attached, you have to have like a name on it. That's really interesting.
It worked out pretty well for Joe Montana football,
and for Madden.
The Master System didn't do so well against the NES, but the Genesis actually held up pretty well against the SNES. Like you said, it actually outsold it a few seasons. And I think overall, it sold about 40 million units throughout its lifetime. And I think as Super Nintendo was a little closer to 50, but super competitive.
Yeah, Nintendo was able to pull out in the end because of Donkey Kong Country. And at that time, they were able to like add a new chip into the cartridges, so it started to look a little bit more advanced than the Sega Genesis games.
I think that's one of the things about the Genesis. I talked a little bit about how I thought the games looked a little bit better. But games like Sonic, you go back to the original, and the first time you get hit and all your rings come out, your animation just slows down to nothing. But I think we were a little more forgiving back then, too.
For sure.
I will say, I'm not very nostalgic for hardware. The Sega Genesis is a system I still own, and I just won't get rid of it. And I've got the games that I love on it. It's a hell of a thing hooking up to a TV these days. But
yeah, that's true. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Shining Force 1 and 2 were my favorite Sega Genesis games. Big turn-based strategy fan. And those games were awesome.
Phantasy Star games too.
Oh yeah,
on the Genesis, those were great.
SimCity was released in 1989. The original SimCity.
No wonder I almost failed college, right?
Well, that's actually what made me pass college.
Yeah.
I actually got a master's degree in urban planning because of SimCity. SimCity was the reason why I have my college degree.
You were like, I think I might want to do this for real.
Yeah.
I was interested in the concepts behind the game. So it was something that I, don't do a whole lot about in high school, and played SimCity and saw that they had this urban planning degree at college. And I was like, let me take some of these classes. I liked it. And ended up getting a degree, which I'm using very well here at IGN.
Yeah. 10 years later, it's how I invented Detroit.
It's funny that whole game is.
Well, I'm sorry.
the whole game is based on the question of like, how do you get poor people to the library, right? And like that's your whole area of study, right? It's just kind of figuring out public transportation and where do you zone for certain things. And
concentric ring theory.
to me, I mean, that's what I love about
NIMBY.
the game. I know they were pressured by, I guess it was Broderbund, to put in scenarios,
Right.
So
make it a
that
real
there's
game.
actually something that there's some scripted challenge. But I just love like the open-ended toy box nature of it, like the accessibility of it, and the fact that the game reflects your values, right? And that it's the same as that other big game that we played, which was Civilization, which is the reason I got a history degree. Like we did.
You guys were really easy to implement.
We did talk about this stuff a lot, but like that game, SimCity, is a game that asks
Thank you, Will Wright and Sid Meier.
Yeah, that game asks you what it should be about, right? Whatever you want it to be about, the game accepts that and kind of feeds back to you a simulation.
And it's like
of
Minecraft
that.
today, right? It like fed into the imagination of young people. Like, it like let you get absorbed and make what you wanted.
And you start telling stories. You're like, oh, this is the ghetto, and this is the slums, and like there's a narrative that you build, that you participate in. It's not just the game developer feeding you content.
Well, they're a lot more plentiful now, but there weren't that many sandbox games back in the day. And like you're saying, that is one of the ones that really allowed you to create something literally out of nothing. I mean, you had this blank slate of land, and then you can do whatever you want to do with it. You don't just have to delve into the world that somebody else built. You're building your own world, and you're making your own stories. And that was very interesting to me, because then I, really kind of saw the power of games as a device that's not just a start point and an end point, but it's something that can live for a long time.
There's a couple good stories about how Will Wright designed SimCity. His first game in 1984 was Raid on Bungling Bay, which is a game I'm familiar with but never actually played. I think it's a top-down military shoot 'em up. And he found that he enjoyed creating maps for the game more than he was enjoying playing the game. So then he thought his next game should be about building these sorts of areas. And he was also inspired by a short story from the time called The Seventh Sally, in which an engineer encounters a deposed tyrant, and so he creates a miniature city with artificial citizens for the tyrant to oppress.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, he was also reading books on systems management and just kind of getting, I guess, really impressed with this notion of how a decision in one area can affect something somewhere else, which I thought was really interesting. And it teaches you about city planning, and it asks you questions about sort of your own political beliefs, like what do you value? Like, how do you feel about nuclear power? How do you feel about public transportation? Like these are like relevant issues to society, but here confronted in a game, which is, I think, much more easy to digest.
As somebody with an urban planning degree, I can tell you that actually the game is pretty good.
Can we get that up on one of the screens back here?
He just starts every sentence
Just his
after that one.
diploma.
Yeah, this is the ticker at the bottom.
I can say that they actually do explore a lot of the concepts that you really talk about in those classes. So great job with that.
You actually wrote a paper on SimCity for your.
Well, I was going to do my thesis on SimCity 2000, but it got delayed and came out too late. But I was going to.
Oh, these developers don't think about the impact
I know,
that the delay has on a person.
I actually didn't get into SimCity until a couple years later. It was a launch game for the Super Nintendo, and that's where I actually played.
See, I played so much SimCity on Super Nintendo. Like that's where I learned, and I remember those scenarios and all the weird, like, oh, a typhoon's gonna hit the city or whatever.
Or the Godzilla that comes and wrecks the game on the PC or on the Mac. It's actually Bowser, isn't it?
Yeah.
I believe so, yeah.
So they added like all these little Nintendo touches to it, which I think is super cute.
Yeah. All right, switching over to the entertainment, movies and TV side of things. Batman, Tim Burton's Batman, was released in the summer of '89.
Yeah.
And I can remember what a phenomenon that was.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a big deal. It had Michael Keaton, who people thought maybe this guy isn't right, and it had Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
And he got more money for that movie than anybody had gotten for a movie up until that point.
Negotiated a crazy contract.
Yeah. I heard actually that they wanted Jack Nicholson for that role, and he wasn't interested. And so they went to Robin Williams to use him as bait.
Oh.
And once Robin Williams said, sure, I'll do it, they went back to Jack and they said, hey, Robin Williams actually wants to do it.
That's mean.
Well, that's me.
No, seriously, and that's why Robin Williams turned down the role of the Riddler in the third Batman movie. He's like, screw you guys. Like, you basically used me.
You're
so
just
I'm not
going to get
doing
somebody
that.
else after I agree to this.
Yeah. But yeah, it was massively influential. I mean, it has this great Art Deco look. I mean, just the visuals in that movie are fantastic, and the performances are really great too. The one thing I didn't like is I didn't like the Joker origin story. Like
So they change it so that Joker kills Bruce Wayne's parents.
Yeah, well, you never really know where the Joker comes from. That's one of the things I really liked about the Heath Ledger version of the character. Is just like he just shows up and you have no answers for who he is, and
you don't need them.
Keeps it
You don't
mysterious.
need
Like,
them, right?
better,
But they try to force that into this Tim Burton movie, and it makes it a little hokey.
Yeah, and it's funny because now, like, if anything gets changed in the comics, people freak out. But like the Burton Batman films are actually like he takes some like pretty big liberties, and I think as self-contained movies they work, but as like if you really compared them to the comics, they went in all kinds of weird directions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this for me, like obviously I saw it years later, but for me it was like kind of an important part of what made me like movies. Like it was one of those, like, because my dad would watch like really classic movies. Like I watched, growing up, I watched a lot of like very old movies, and this was one of the first movies I remember watching on tape and being like, oh, this is cool. Like movies can be cool and interesting and dark. And I don't know, the lighting in it was also really great.
I'm being told we should spend some time talking about the lighting.
Yeah. No, but seriously,
but just the visual style of it too, right? How colorful it was, like, you know, the contrast between the dark and the light, but then the big like greens and purples of the Joker.
Well, if you remember though, actually the movie is a very dark movie. I mean, just literally the screen is dark a lot. They actually had to lighten it up for re-releases because people complained about it so much. But you have to remember when you're sitting there in the late '80s and you're hearing that a Batman movie is coming out, your last memory of that character, unless you're a diehard comic book fan, is Adam West. Yep. Right? Like the really campy TV show that they did.
Sure, really colorful.
And you saw Superman came out, you know, in the late '70s, and like there was some hope there. But like this was we take for granted now that you can go to the movie theater and see all kinds of amazing superhero movies.
And see a new superhero movie every 2 weeks.
That was not the case in the '80s. That was totally not the case. So this is a big thing.
I guess they made 4 Superman movies. I don't know when 4 came out. Probably mid '80s, somewhere around there. So
my guess is that we didn't cover that in a series called History of
Awesome. I don't think so. My point is just I think it's been several years since we've gotten a big superhero movie at that point.
Yeah, and this is also, I think, responsible for what kind of Batman has become today, which is that he's the dark superhero. Like, it is dark, it is grounded, and it is like, the Christopher Nolan trilogy would never have happened without this. Like, you would never have been able to get
Michael Keaton's the guy who said, hey, maybe Batman and Bruce Wayne should have different voices.
Yeah.
You know, and that immediately rolled into Batman the Animated Series with Kevin Conroy and his approach to the character, and obviously Christopher Nolan in the way that the Christian Bale approached it.
Christian Bale took it 80 steps further.
He went a little too far, maybe, but I mean, but that idea that like there are different ways of expressing yourself as either character is something that Michael Keaton, I think, pioneered.
And because when you become Batman, you become Batman. Like, it's not just like a dude wearing the cowl. Like, it is like he is like a force to be reckoned with.
Maybe it's Bruce Wayne that he becomes, though.
Maybe
Bruce Wayne is the real mask.
Was that the story? He actually couldn't move his head in the cowl in the original.
There are all kinds of things. Like he couldn't hear through it. The ears were too large for him to sit in the Batmobile.
So it was like really hot.
He was claustrophobic, but like he used a lot of that in the performance, just like that uncomfortableness to like get into character as somebody who's really not scared exactly, but really threatened and kind of in this weird place.
I appreciate
that little actor grew up to be Birdman.
Right.
I appreciate that it wasn't an origin story.
Yeah.
They didn't spend any time
They got
setting up the character. It's just in the beginning of the movie, he's Batman.
Because it's not like you need that, right? You tell your grandma Batman, she's like, oh, right, I get it.
Got it.
Like, she already knows.
Got a pretty hip grandma.
I would say one of the things that I think is probably most memorable for me from that movie, though, is the Danny Elfman score.
Yeah.
Like, Danny Elfman's score from that movie, like, I identify that with Batman. And he had worked with Tim Burton on Pee-wee before.
Yeah.
He was big adventure came out before.
Probably Beetlejuice as well?
I think they've collaborated in almost everything.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, Danny Elfman is, I think, scored all but a few of Tim Burton's movies.
Yep.
But yeah, that score, those themes, they used them in the Batman animated series. They still use them today in the Batman Lego games. Like they'll still pull out pieces of that score, and it's just, to me, it's instantly recognizable.
Yeah, super iconic.
Apparently, Tim Burton though is not super proud of Batman. There's a quote from an interview years later where he says, "I liked parts of it, but the whole movie is mainly boring to me. It's okay, but was more of a cultural phenomenon than a great movie."
I mean, think about what Tim Burton thinks of as normal, and so what it must take for him to think something is like cool or interesting.
But I also think, I mean, looking back on it, it's not a great movie, but it is a fun movie. You know, in terms of like, you know, just as when you compare like the great classics of movies, it's not a great movie. I mean, but it's a very fun movie, very stylistic movie. I mean, it's Tim Burton, so everything he does is very stylistic.
Yeah. It's got Kim Basinger. It's got Jack Palance is in it as like a crime boss. Billy D. Williams plays Harvey Dent. Like the movie is insane.
It's packed,
I also actually like Batman Returns. I know sometimes people give that one a hard time.
What's a
lot of times people give that a hard time.
You know, I agree though. I like Batman Returns as well. I think I was like older by that point. Like, I'm still not like, I was pretty young. But like,
it did come out later. That's how that works.
The sequel came out after the first game.
It's interesting though, thinking about the original Batman movie, I can't think of a lot of superhero movies that only have one villain in anymore.
Yeah,
you know, like you move on to Batman Forever.
Well, because now you're setting up the 11 sequels. Like that's the thing. Like now it's like more forward thinking, whereas back then it was potentially a self-contained thing.
But even like the first Christopher Nolan Batman movie, it's like there are a couple of villains in that movie right away, and it's like I like the simplicity of like, look, this is just Batman and the Joker.
Yeah. Yep. One of my main memories of Batman, it was my second or third time seeing it in theaters, and there's the moment when he rescues Vicky Vale and he's going to grapple away and he grabs her and he asks her how much she weighs before they goes, and she says something that's apparently low, like 110, 112, and this woman in the theater stands up and goes, bitch! And I was like 11.
You're like, Mom, come on, I'm trying to watch the movie.
Batman was the #1 domestic movie of 1989 here in the U.S., but the #1 movie worldwide was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Oh yeah.
Which had been released a couple months earlier in May. Discuss.
What an interesting fact.
I've never heard of it. Yeah, it's like Last Crusade is funny because and again, like I saw everything way later, obviously when I was a little older, but I watched all three at once. Like I watched all three Indiana Jones movies when I saw them for the first time, and like I was so obsessed with Raiders. Like I thought it was so good, and so I actually like hated Last Crusade because I was like, oh, like Marcus Brody is so different, it's so like cheesy, and I just thought like I didn't like it as a kid, and I was like the only one because like so many people that's their favorite. And
Do you think it's kind
now,
of like the Star Wars prequels? I think younger kids like the prequels, the newer movies.
I mean, maybe
more
it's
than
like
the
I think I was just a
original
weird
Star
kid.
Wars?
But
You were a weird kid?
I guess I mean like I really liked Raiders, which is probably the most mature of the three. Like,
I mean,
it's the more
Raiders is the best one. So.
yeah, for sure. But it's just funny because revisiting them as an adult, like I can see why everyone loves Last Crusade because it does like I think Indiana Jones as a character is best defined in that. I think in Raiders, like you understand him more, the humor is better, like you get a little bit more of that, like, oh, like he's like wisecracking while he's in this super dangerous situation. Like I think that is the most like
You get the perspective of his dad.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. Like honestly, like I love Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think Indiana Jones is fantastic. I actually don't think he's much of a character, right?
Right.
I mean, he's a hat and a whip and some one-liners. Like, and when they try to bring into Last Crusade, like he's somebody's kid and he's got this weird family relationship. It just doesn't work. And it's the same thing with his son in the more recent movie. You know, where it's like,
Shia LaBeouf.
I don't know that I need him to be related to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps make him relatable. I think that's what they were going for. So I don't know. I'm conflicted on Last Crusade in a weird way.
It's funny that the third one though is the origin story of Indiana Jones.
Essentially,
I mean, the third one, what was supposed to be the last one, because they kind of thought about it as a trilogy first, but. The
How
third
dare
one,
you forget about young Indiana Jones?
But the third one is really the one that they're introducing a lot of, you know, where he got the name Indy, where he got his hat, why the whip
how he
becomes
got
so
the scar.
iconic.
Yeah.
Why he doesn't like snakes. Yeah.
They're all. It's funny because it's also it's the easiest to rewatch. It's the most fun of them.
It does have great action sequences,
Yes,
particularly
exactly.
the tank sequence towards the end of the movie.
I would say it's also maybe with the exception of the opening to Temple of Doom, like the entire gigantic like falling down the waterfall and the raft and all that stuff. Like this one feels the most Spielberg too. Like if you look back at like his body of work, this one feels more, I think, indicative of like what he liked to do and how his movies are fun and like what made him like this gigantic like blockbuster success. Like I think this one is like the most palatable for big audiences. So it's like not surprising to me that it did that well because like Last Crusade is like a very easy movie to watch even as a kid. Like you can make a young kid watch that movie and even though there's violence in it, like they'll enjoy it.
Kids
probably
love
enjoy it
violence.
more, by the way.
Kids love violence.
I also really liked the LucasArts graphic adventure
Yeah.
for Last Crusade.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. That was a great, you know, with all the little choices that you had at the bottom that you could pick. And
There was like a decoder that came in the box that you had to use to solve some of the puzzles in the game. In November of 1989, The Little Mermaid was released.
Oh, that started it all, really, right? There's been a whole like princess machine over at Disney, and I know it just kicked off with Little Mermaid. I mean, every sort of movie since then, or at least several for the following decade, kind of followed that same pattern.
Yeah, well, so Disney had a long string of hits in the 90s, and it seems like Little Mermaid kind of launched that, but the movie they did right after that was The Rescuers Down Under, that I don't think people really,
not quite.
That one hasn't really stayed in our psyche.
I love the original Rescuers, but
Yeah.
Rescuers Down Under, not so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Little Mermaid was the last real painted one, right? Like
That was the last
hand-drawn.
Yeah,
Yeah, traditionally hand-drawn cell animation one.
Because then they went right to computer, like with Rescuers Down Under.
Yeah. There's some great songs in that movie, too. And then in 1989, The Simpsons aired. After previously airing on The Tracy Ullman Show since 1987.
Can we just watch some early Simpsons for the rest of this episode?
Yeah.
Well, I figure we got about 7 minutes left if you want to just let us know all the quotes.
No, it was a super short season. It was 13 episodes. I mean, James Brooks had worked with Matt Groening to do the Tracy Ullman shorts, and they wanted to do a full-length, TV episode season. And a lot of people didn't have faith in it. They wanted to do shorter segments, like let's do 3 or 4, 6 or 7 minute bits, and they pushed really hard to make a
cartoons
whole
on
episode.
prime time, too. Like that was outrageous back then,
Yeah, and a cartoon where the animation style wasn't, you know, super rubbery. Like it's cartoonish, but it's a very realistic cartoon when you think about the way that the world works for those guys. And that was new for cartoons back then.
And also a cartoon that introduced so many characters, right? You had so many characters in the Simpsons world, and that was actually one of the things that really drew me to that, because it felt more like a real world, like, you know, as you really experience, than just a sitcom where you see the same 8 characters over and over. It also wasn't a family that loved each other all the time. They had their issues. They had their problems. The dad would strangle the son every once in a while. I mean, that stuff happened. It was real.
But in the first season, like I think a lot of people push their memory back onto that first season. In the first season, Homer actually wasn't like the oafish kind of mad.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't as
a little more
stupid.
intellectual.
He's dumb, but
Lisa
he's
was
like a
kind
good
of a
dad.
troublemaker, right?
Yeah.
And he was a little out of touch, but he wasn't a bad father necessarily.
I think it was really important for Fox as a network too. Like I think it like sort of
was
like
their
defined
first
this, like,
hit.
yeah, it like
their first
defined
hit.
them as like a new player basically. And I think it like in the way you were talking about the Genesis and like the attitude with it, right? Like that was like a really interesting. I think '89 is a really interesting year because it's like yeah, like we can buck traditions and we can be a little edgier. And I think like that is what Fox was, and that's what The Simpsons was.
Yeah.
For me, it was the first show that I started recording regularly on VHS tape. So I was the keeper of the tapes among our friends.
Like pause for the commercials.
Oh yeah, no, I would pause for the commercials. I would sit there and watch it, but I would make sure that I had, you know, unfortunately everything was in that long play, so 6 hours of episodes on a tape, so the quality wasn't that great. But I had like 20 tapes, you know, over a few years, and my friends we would either watch them when we got home from work or from school, or people would borrow them and they would, you know, copy my tapes. But this is in the days before Netflix or before The Simpsons was even syndicated. So once an episode went up, you couldn't watch it again.
Yeah.
If we both had to work that night, it was like, wow, you have to program the VCR, and like, who knows if it's going to work or not.
Yeah.
And then you got the stupid commercials, and it was the worst.
Yep. Sometimes I would
The
actually
worst.
go through and hook 2 VCRs up and cut the commercials out and do a master tape too. 'Cause that's how dedicated I was to The Simpsons, man. We had them all in order.
Okay, so you didn't bring Girls Home.
Yeah, right. No, you mentioned getting off work, and I think the reason we remember that show so much is everybody hung out at our house, and whoever was home would watch it when it was on, and then somebody got off work and came over, and they were like, let's watch The Simpsons. And then the next person who got off work came over, and by the end of the night, if you were there at the start, like you would watch that episode like 5 or 6 times, you know, and it's like sort of burned into your brain. One thing I will say though about the family thing, it was kind of controversial, right? There was a lot of parents groups who were upset about it. There were a lot of schools who outlawed the merchandise.
Right.
It's like you couldn't wear Bart Simpson shirts because he had like this very rebellious, like anti-establishment attitude.
Underachiever.
Yeah, it's the whole like eat my shorts, down with
man.
homework and all that stuff. Like authority figures took that really seriously and tried to crack down on the show. But other people, fans of the show, said no, actually, like this is a loving family. They're tuned into each other, even if they're a little dysfunctional. Like at least they're paying attention to each other's lives. And I remember that was a really strong debate among like you know, school officials and things like that at the time.
It's so interesting that it's on now and it's come so far. Like obviously, like in a lot of ways, it's worse.
Is it still on? I didn't know that. Is it still running?
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I don't know. It's really interesting to me, like that legacy.
Yeah.
I don't think back then you would have been like, oh, this is gonna be on for 20. Like I will have a family by the time you know this is still airing. I don't know. I can't imagine anyone expected that at the time.
I like to think that it's not just nostalgia. I like to think that the first, you know, 8 seasons were actually better, but I mean, I'm not sure. I don't really watch The Simpsons anymore because
No, they were better.
I fell out of favor with them because they just weren't as funny as they used to be. You know, they used to have The Simpsons used to be structured where they had like 3 or 4 little vignettes that went on. There was one continuous line and then these little mini stories in. So it was a lot. It was great writing and it was a lot to keep track of, as opposed to again your normal sitcom, which is just kind of this base writing and very easy to follow. You know, we literally had a secret language with Simpson quotes where Steve and I and a lot of our friends could talk to each other just with Simpsons quotes. I mean,
we still do that here in the office.
Yeah.
I mean, there are plenty of Simpsons fans, and that we talk a lot in those terms.
There
Dan
wasn't a
Stapleton
quote.
has the entire series memorized apparently because he knows all of them.
I mean, there was a situation that The Simpsons hadn't already covered in the shows that, you know, you couldn't use a quote from. So yeah, I mean, it was just such a big influence on my life.
I will say one thing that's really interesting, going back to look at the notes for the show, is even in that first episode, you know, there's Skinner, there's Mr. Burns, like all the people that you think of. Moe's in there, Barney's in there, and then in the first season you add in, you know, Smithers and Milhouse, and like all the people you think of as like core to the series.
Yeah,
they were
they're
right there from the beginning, and many of them in that very first Christmas episode, which was only the premiere because the one they wanted to premiere with came back with such terrible animation from overseas that they had to send it back. They were on the verge of canceling the show because they thought this won't ever work. But they had a big argument with the animation company, and they came back with an improved version. and they convinced Fox to let them delay till Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, which was the very first time we saw a 22-minute long Simpsons episode.
Santa's Little Helper.
Yeah.
Still running today. It's the longest running American sitcom, and of course led to South Park, Family Guy, King of the Hill, Futurama, The Critic, all these other.
And I mean, in some ways, even like Parks and Rec got like heavily inspired by The Simpsons, like in terms of that ensemble.
Finally, for 1989, we can't end the show without talking about Mystery Science Theater 3000, which officially came to the Comedy Channel. I'd forgotten that before Comedy Central was the Comedy Channel.
Do you remember all they had for like about 3 years were the under construction bars that they had at the bottom of every single thing?
Yeah. Their programming was such a mess. They had like Higgins, Boys and Gruber and Short Attention Span Theater and all kinds of stuff. But Mystery Science Theater 3000 was one of those ones that like always delivered. I mean, it's just so funny constantly. And was a great way for people to gain access to the types of movies that they were showing, right? Like back before you were saying, you know, you have Netflix and things like that today. If you wanted to see Santa Claus versus the Martians, like, good luck. You know, you might only ever see that on MST3K.
I mean, it reminded me of when I was a kid. I had this little black and white TV in my room, and my mom wouldn't let me watch it after a certain time, but I would get under my covers with this little 13-inch black and white TV and watch crappy movies on, like, you know, our UHF channels. And that reminded me of that, right? It reminded me of really watching those kind of crappy movies that you can only see on UHF at 2 in the morning. But yeah, for us, again, I mean, it was something that you just bust out laughing with, you know, because you're making the same jokes, right? This was before you would watch those crappy movies and you would make those jokes, and now somebody was doing it, you know, with you. And what a crazy in-depth concept for the simplicity of just making fun of a movie, that they're up on this space station and they get shot a movie, you know, every week. And he built these robots to go, like like how they got to the concept of that from just making fun of a movie.
There was no second draft for the concept for that, so they're just like, sure, that's fine. But it's funny because you think about the context for that and what we do today with you know, DVD commentaries and live plays here at IGN, right? Like we're doing this thing that these guys pioneered, you know, several years ago. It's amazing.
And it holds up really well. Like the jokes are still funny, and like the fact that the movies, like now they're more dated, but that almost makes it better. Like that almost makes it more entertaining. So yeah, and obviously there's still like riff tracks and all these things that have evolved from it.
I have to say, I was always more of a Joel man than a Mike man. I like Mike,
I agree,
but I always like Joel more.
I agree. You talk about how quotable Simpsons was. Mystery Science Theater is another thing that's very quotable. I think that's something that geek culture really likes to gather around, is quoting stuff that they love. They do it with Monty Python as well. And I just remember me and my friends always like.
It's like a password. You know, it's like, you're a cool guy. We can get along.
Manos, the Hand of Fate, becoming such a big. I mean, I'm sure more people know about Manos, Hand of Fate now after Mystery Science Theater than anybody ever knew about it before.
Nobody knew about it before.
That's exactly it. At least 4 people know about Manos, Hand of Fate now. So.
All right, that wraps up our coverage of why 1989 was so awesome. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Tal. Thank you, Andrew. Next up is 1990. We'll be covering stuff like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Final Fantasy. My name is Damon Hatfield. Stay tuned.